Hello and welcome back to When Wounds Speak, episode 7. Have you ever done something and almost immediately wondered, why did I do that? Maybe you shut down. Maybe you become defensive. Maybe you pushed someone away. Or maybe you said yes when you intended to say no. Maybe you tried to control a situation because uncertainty felt unbearable. Or maybe you walked out of a relationship before you got left. Or perhaps you promised yourself, I'm never going to do this again. And then you did. What if instead of beginning with, what's wrong with me, we asked a different question? And that question would be, what might this behavior be connected to? And what might it be trying to protect? Well, welcome to episode 7 of When Wounds Speak. But before we continue, please remember that When Wounds Speak is intended for educational and personal reflection. It certainly is not a substitute for therapy, for any diagnosis, or any individualized medical or mental health care. If this episode brings up difficult emotions or experiences for you, please consider seeking support from a qualified mental health professional. Again, welcome to Wound Speak. Understanding the wounds beneath our behavior does not excuse harmful behavior or remove personal accountability. It's important that we have that and understand that very clearly. All it does is it helps us understand what may be influencing the behavior so that healing, so that responsibility and meaningful change can begin. So today we arrive at the part of the Kristo emotional wound healing journey that other people can often see. And what they can often see is our behavior. Behavior is where our inner world becomes visible. It is where our wounds, our beliefs, our emotions, and our protective adaptations begin to appear in what we do, and sometimes in what we repeatedly do. But behavior does not tell the whole story. To understand why we keep doing what we do, we must become curious about what is happening beneath that behavior, beneath that observable behavior. It is critical that we become curious about that. Behavior is often what we notice first. Behavior tends to get our attention because behavior is visible. We can see someone withdraw. We can hear defensiveness. We can also notice people pleasing, as well as we can experience someone's need for control, someone's need to retaliate or hurt someone. And because behavior is visible, it is often where judgment begins. Why are you like that? Why do you always do this? Or internally, we think, why can't I stop doing this? But the Crystal emotional wound healing model asks us to look beneath what is visible. The model asks us to remain curious and look underneath the behavior that we observe. What we do is only part of the story. This is why our established behavior marker is an iceberg. Above the surface is behavior. That is what people can see. That is what people can experience. That is what people can observe. But underneath the surface, there is more. Underneath the surface, there may be an experience that happened, the meaning we gave it, the wound it created, the belief that formed thereafter, the emotions that followed, and the protective adaptation we developed to keep ourselves from being ever hurt again. So behavior does not appear from nowhere. There is often a story beneath the surface. Let's return to a review of our journey so far. We have traveled a long way to get here, and we deliberately did not begin with behavior. An experience happened, meaning developed, a wound formed. Beliefs developed around that wound. Those beliefs influenced emotion. And then protective strategies developed around those emotions. And now those strategies can become visible. Behavior is the next step in the pathway. In the Kristo emotional wound healing model, behavior is, as we already mentioned, what becomes observable. It is what we do, or sometimes what we repeatedly avoid doing. But there is an important caution here. Not every behavior comes from an emotional wound. It's important to note that. Not every choice is trauma, and not every habit needs a hidden psychological explanation. The Kristo emotional wound healing model is not asking us to pathologize ordinary human behavior. It actually gives us a framework for examining behaviors that seem repetitive, behaviors that seem confusing, behaviors that are disproportionate or connected to unresolved pain. There is an essential distinction we need to make. Remember the distinction we protected carefully in episode 6. I won't need anyone. That is an internal protective strategy. That is something we tell ourselves internally, psychologically. It is protective adaptation. I won't need anyone. But when that strategy becomes, number one, refusing help, withdrawing when someone gets close, or ending a relationship before the other person can leave, we are now seeing the behavior that comes from that protective strategy. So the internal strategy has become observable, so to speak. Protective adaptation is not the behavior. Just for clarification, behavior is one way that protective strategy may become expressed. Another element that needs clarification or emphasis is that the same behavior can mean different things. Two people can do exactly the same thing for completely different reasons. Two people may both become quiet during conflict. One may be protecting against rejection. The other may be trying to keep anger from escalating, while a third one may simply need time to think. So there's no way we can look at a behavior alone and confidently declare what wound caused it. Behavior simply gives us a clue. It does not give us a diagnosis. Now, one wound can produce different behaviors. So, in essence, the reverse is also true. The same wound can contribute to very different behaviors. Someone afraid of rejection may withdraw. Someone else may cling. Someone may become extraordinarily accommodating. And another one may test relationships repeatedly. Another one may simply leave first. That is why the Kristo emotional wound healing model is not a formula that says, if you do X, you must have wound Y. It is a framework for curiosity. Sometimes behavior is communication. Sometimes behavior communicates something we do not yet know how to say or we're unable to say. Behavior sometimes may communicate the following: I'm scared. Please don't leave. Don't get too close. I need to know I matter. I cannot tolerate feeling powerless again. The behavior may be imperfect communication. Sometimes it may even be harmful communication, but it can still be communicating something underneath the surface. It's important that we also note that understanding does not remove responsibility. This principle becomes even more important now. Understanding the wound underneath someone's behavior does not make harmful behavior acceptable. Pain does not give us permission to harm people. A wound can explain something without excusing it. And we can hold two truths at the same time. I understand why this developed, and I am responsible for what I do with it now. Compassion and accountability are critical. Compassion helps us understand the pathway. Accountability helps us decide what we do with what we now understand. We do not have to choose between them. Healing can hold both. I can have compassion for the part of me that learned to protect myself and still take responsibility for what my behavior does to me and to other people. Let's follow the whole story. Now we can complete the example we deliberately stopped in episode 6. Repeated rejection. And the meaning that was formed is I'm not wanted, and the wound is the wound of rejection. And the belief is people I need will eventually reject me. The emotion that comes with that is fear, sadness, shame, and disappointment. The protective adaptation is then I won't need anyone. I will not need anyone. And now that strategy may become observable. No, I'm fine. I don't need any help. Thank you. I got this. Pulling away when someone gets close or leaving first when rejection begins to feel possible. Now the behavior has context, and that does not automatically make it healthy, but it makes it understandable. Let's look at how Zenra's protection becomes visible. I know you remember Zenra. Her protective strategy was, I'll take care of myself. In episode 6, we stopped before she responded to the offer of help. Now, her coworker offers assistance, if you remember very well. Zenra smiles and says, no, I've got it. And she keeps carrying everything herself. That is behavior. But if we only saw the behavior, we might call her stubborn, proud, controlling, or fiercely independent. The Kristo emotional wound healing model invites us to ask what lies underneath the behavior of, no, I've got it. Now let us explore what's beneath Zenra's, I've got it. The clinical question here is flexibility and choice. It's not whether independence is inherently unhealthy. Zenra may genuinely be very capable, well capable, and that is important to note. And we're not turning competence into pathology. The question is whether she has a choice. Can she accept help when she wants it, when she needs it? Can she depend on trustworthy people? Or does the old protective strategy decide for her? That is the distinction we're beginning to explore and understand. Now let's return to Arahaz. Someone he cares about is quieter than usual. You know the story. Nothing overtly negative has happened, but his belief says people eventually leave. Emotion rises. His protective adaptation says, don't let anyone matter too much. And now the protection begins becoming visible. Maybe he becomes quieter too. Maybe he stops reaching. Maybe he emotionally pulls back before he knows whether anything is actually wrong. Maybe he actually leaves. That is behavior. Again, when it comes to Arahaz, we notice behavior makes sense in context. Again, we're not excusing the behavior and we're not pretending that we can read someone's mind simply by observing them. We're following the story we've already established for learning purposes. So from the outside, what we observe from Arahaz is him pulling away. But when we look at what the model tells us is what's going on inside him is something in me is preparing for the possibility of losing you. Same behavior, just much deeper context. We all know that behavior can be varied, and we certainly know that behavior can move in opposite directions. One person's protection makes them silent, another's person's makes them talk more. One withdraws, another pursues. One avoids conflict, another starts conflict before someone else can. One refuses help, another constantly seeks reassurance. That is why behavior itself is not enough. We have to become curious about the pathway underneath that behavior. What should we do when we notice behavior? This is the practical question I want you to begin carrying with you. When you notice the behavior, pause before immediately judging it. Ask, what might be underneath the surface? Not, what excuse can I make? But, what can I understand? The small shift from judgment to curiosity can change what becomes possible next. So we have to ask what might be underneath the surface of the behavior that I'm observing. We're not trying to excuse it. The next question, the last question we ask ourselves is, what can I understand from what I'm observing? As we near the end of episode 7, I want to give you a few questions to sit with, and here they are. What behavior keeps repeating in my life? What behavior keeps repeating in my life? When does it tend to appear? When does it tend to appear? What emotion usually comes just before it? What emotion usually comes just before it? What am I trying to protect myself from feeling? What am I trying to protect myself from feeling? What protective rule may be operating underneath it? What protective rule may be operating underneath it? And finally, what might I choose differently if I felt safe enough to pause? What might I choose differently if I felt safe enough to pause? Do not use these questions to interrogate yourself. Rather, use them to become curious about yourself. Another Another exercise that I would like for you to use in instances where you immediately notice a behavior that did not make sense to you is to just pause for a minute and ask yourself, what happened just before it? And it being the behavior that you just demonstrated that didn't make sense to you. What happened just before it? What did I feel? What did I believe? What was the protection trying to accomplish? Do I have another choice? So, what happened just before it? What did I feel? What did I believe? What was the protection trying to accomplish? And do I have another choice? And usually we do have other choices. Let's look at what should happen between the protection and the behavior, between the protective adaptation or the protective strategy and the behavior. Healing does not always begin by stopping a behavior instantly. Don't we wish? Don't we wish that these behaviors that we have could just stop instantly the minute we notice them? But sometimes healing begins with 1 second of awareness. A second of awareness can turn things around. If you notice something such as, oh, I'm pulling away, I'm saying yes when I want to say no, I'm trying to control this, I'm about to run, or I'm refusing help again. That moment right there, that moment of awareness matters so much because awareness creates space, and space creates the possibility of choice. So we want to go from automatic to becoming intentional. We're wanting to emphasize flexibility rather than the suppression of your protective responses. The goal is certainly not perfection. It's it's not never becoming activated, and it's not eliminating every protective response that we have. The goal here is increasing our ability to notice what is happening inside of us before the old pathway, that old protective pathway, automatically decides what happens next. So there's a trigger, then protection. And instead of immediately moving into behavior, there's a pause. We pause and we become aware. And that awareness allows us to make a choice. And that is a very different kind of power, may I say. Allow me to tell you that what you do is not the totality of who you are. A fact you already know. I want to leave room for one more distinction. Your behavior matters. Your behavior has consequences. Your behavior requires responsibility. But your behavior, as I just mentioned, is not the totality of who you are. You can examine something that you do. You can take responsibility for it. You can repair what needs repairing, and you can learn another way. Accountability does not require reducing a person to their worst behavior. Wow, the pathway advances. We are one more step ahead in our journey. The wound became surrounded by beliefs, and those beliefs influenced emotion, and emotion contributed to protection or protective strategies, and protection became visible through behavior. But behavior rarely happens only once, and behavior rarely happens in isolation. When behaviors repeat between people, something else begins to form. That is where the pathway takes us next. Here is the $1,000,000 question. What happens when our behaviors meet someone else's? What happens when my hyperindependence meets your need to be wanted? What happens when protection meets protection? When my people pleasing meets your need for reassurance? Or what happens when my fear of rejection meets your fear of abandonment? Repeated behaviors between people can begin creating something larger. Relationship patterns. We are not teaching that stage yet, but we now can see why it comes next. And that is where we're going into in episode 8. This week, I would like for you to notice one behavior without immediately judging it. I would like for you to pause, look beneath the surface, ask, what am I feeling? What am I believing? What am I protecting? And then, do I have another choice here? Behavior makes more sense when we understand what it is protecting. But understanding also gives us an opportunity to choose what happens next. Therefore, listen with compassion, respond with wisdom. Above all, choose healing. I'll see you in the next episode of When Wounds Speak. This is Dr. Caroline Kristo. Just a reminder, When Wounds Speak is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for psychotherapy, mental health care. It's not a diagnosis or other professional services. As we close today again, please remember, behavior is often the language of a wound. Every wound has a story, and every story deserves to be heard. Therefore, continue listening with compassion, respond with wisdom, choose healing. Thank you so much for joining me.